The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting an amber glow over the winding waters of the Louisiana Bayou. Mist clung to the surface like a living blanket, curling and twisting around the gnarled cypress trees, whose roots clawed deep into the muddy banks. In the distance, the silhouette of a massive plantation mansion emerged through the fog, a structure that seemed both regal and foreboding, its shutters closed like watchful eyes guarding secrets that had been buried for decades. The long, winding dirt road that led to the house was flanked by ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss, their branches swaying gently in the evening breeze, creating shadows that danced like specters on the ground. Every step forward seemed to echo against the silence of the swamp, a reminder that this land had seen countless tragedies, whispers of a past that refused to stay buried. Isabella Duval sat upright in the carriage, her gloved hands resting lightly on her lap, though her fingers twitched with a mixture of anticipation and unease. At 23, she was both young and determined, a new bride stepping into a life that promised wealth, status, and luxury. But what lay ahead was anything but ordinary. Her dress, a rich shade of ivory silk with intricate lace trim, shimmered faintly in the fading light, and her dark hair was pinned elegantly, though a few rebellious strands escaped to frame her pale, tense face. She had grown up in New Orleans, far from the remote reaches of the Bayou, and yet nothing in the bustling streets or grand townhouses of the city could have prepared her for the raw, haunting beauty of this wild and untamed landscape. The carriage jolted over a hidden route, and Isabella's heart leapt. She had been warned about the roads leading to the mansion. They were treacherous, prone to sudden dips and hidden puddles, but the sudden lurch still made her clutch the edge of her seat. The coachman, a stoic man whose face was obscured by the brim of his hat, gave no indication of the danger, his hands steady on the reins as the horses snorted and strained against the uneven path. Beyond him, the swamp stretched endlessly, a vast expanse of shadow and water that seemed to hide eyes watching her every move. Frogs croaked in the distance, and somewhere the low howl of a coyote echoed across the marshlands, a chilling reminder that she was entering a place where nature reigned supreme and man was merely a guest. As the mansion drew closer, Isabella noticed the first signs of its age and the weight of history it carried. The paint on the wooden walls was peeling, revealing layers of past hues, each one a silent testament to the decades it had withstood. The tall windows, shuttered and dark, reflected the fiery streaks of the sunset like watchful, judging eyes. The wrought-iron gates that guarded the entrance were rusted but imposing, their intricate designs resembling twisted vines, almost as if the bayou itself had reached out to claim the estate. She felt a shiver trace her spine, not entirely from the chill in the air, but from a growing awareness that this house held secrets far older and darker than its walls suggested. Her eyes wandered to the surrounding grounds. Once, these lawns must have been meticulously kept, a grand display of wealth and refinement, but now they were overgrown, tangled with wild weeds and creeping ivy. Statues of angels and saints, cracked and weathered, stood at odd intervals, their faces eroded by time and the humid, unforgiving climate of the bayou. Birds perched silently on the branches above, their eyes unblinking and sharp, as if judging the intruder daring to cross their domain. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, decaying leaves, and a faint metallic tang that Isabella could not identify. It was an aroma that clung to the skin, lingering in the mind, making her uneasy despite the beauty around her. The carriage finally reached the main entrance, and Isabella dismounted, her heels sinking slightly into the damp soil. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before stepping onto the grand wooden porch. The boards creaked under her weight, a sound amplified in the eerie quiet. She ran her fingers lightly over the carved railing, feeling the grooves worn smooth by countless hands over decades, each touch a ghostly echo of the past. The door loomed before her, massive and imposing, with brass fixtures dulled by time. She reached for the handle, hesitating just long enough for her imagination to fill the silence with whispers and half-formed shadows that seemed to flicker in the corners of her vision. Inside, the mansion was a world apart from the swampy wilderness outside. The interior was dimly lit by tall, narrow windows that allowed only slivers of fading daylight to pierce the gloom. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, catching the last light like tiny drifting stars. The smell of aged wood, candle wax, and something darker, an undercurrent she could not identify, filled the hall. Portraits lined the walls, oil paintings of stern-faced men and women dressed in finery that now seemed almost grotesque in their rigidity. Their eyes followed her as she walked, and Isabella could not shake the feeling that she was being observed, scrutinized by generations long dead. Her footsteps echoed as she explored the first floor, the sound bouncing off the high ceilings and ornate crown molding. Every room she passed told a story. A grand dining hall with a long table scarred by age and use, a parlor with faded upholstery and the faint scent of perfume long evaporated, and a library filled with towering shelves of leather-bound books whose spines were cracked and brittle. She ran her hand over a tome, feeling the powdery dust on her fingertips. The titles hinted at knowledge and power, some benign, some sinister, and she sensed that every object in this house carried the weight of the lives that had passed through these halls. It was in the shadows of the staircase that Isabella first felt a true chill. The steps spiraled upward, each one groaning softly under her tentative weight, and she noticed faint scratches along the banister, as if someone or something had clawed at it in desperation or fear. A draught of cold air brushed against her neck, and for a moment she imagined whispers, faint voices calling her name. She shook her head, forcing herself to focus, but the unease lingered. There was an unnatural quiet here, a stillness that pressed against her chest and slowed her breathing. The mansion was alive, not in the way of warmth or comfort, but in the way of memory, holding the echoes of sorrow, cruelty, and secrets long concealed. Her exploration was interrupted by the sound of distant footsteps, not her own, but someone moving within the house. Isabella froze, her breath catching in her throat. She could hear the faint click of boots on wood, deliberate and measured. She glanced toward the hallway, but it was empty. The silence returned, heavy and almost oppressive. A sense of being watched grew stronger, and she realized that the mansion, for all its grandeur, was a place that resisted intrusion. It was not merely a home, it was a keeper of stories, a guardian of mysteries that were never meant to be unearthed. As evening deepened into twilight, Isabella found herself in a small sitting room near the rear of the mansion, its windows overlooking a narrow channel of the bayou. The water glistened faintly in the moonlight, reflecting the skeletal branches of trees and the faint mist that swirled across the surface. She could hear the distant splash of a fish or the sudden flap of wings, sounds that made her heart race with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Sitting down in a high-backed chair, she ran her fingers over the velvet upholstery, worn smooth in the center, and allowed herself a moment to absorb the weight of the place. She was a stranger here, yes, but she could already sense the invisible threads that tied her to the mansion's past, pulling her into a story that was as beautiful as it was terrifying. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of the trees outside or the distant cry of an animal. Isabella's mind wandered to the stories she had heard about the plantation, the sudden disappearances, the whispered warnings from locals, and the tragic fates of those who had lived here before her. At first, she dismissed them as superstition, but now, sitting in the dim glow of the sitting room, she could not ignore the oppressive weight of history that pressed upon her. Every shadow seemed alive, every creak of the floorboards a signal that she was not alone, that the past had eyes, and it was watching her with keen interest. Despite her unease, there was a strange allure to the mansion. Isabella felt drawn to its mysteries, compelled to uncover the stories hidden behind the closed doors and cracked walls. It was as if the house itself demanded that she know its secrets, that she confront the darkness that had lain dormant for so long. She rose from the chair and approached a window, peering out into the bayou. The fog hung low, thick and impenetrable, and in its depths she imagined shapes moving just beyond sight, figures that would not be revealed until the time was right, and somewhere deep within her, a part of her welcomed it. The challenge, the danger, the chance to step beyond the ordinary and into a tale that would define her life forever. As night fell fully over the bayou, the mansion seemed to shift with the darkness, its towering silhouette both protective and threatening. Isabella knew that this was only the beginning, that the coming days would test her courage, her sanity, and her very soul. Yet, as she lit a single candle and placed it on the mantel, the flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows across the room, she felt a thrill unlike any she had known. She was here now, at the heart of the bayou, standing on the threshold of a story that would haunt her and her audience long after the night ended. The journey into the Louisiana bride's world of secrets, shadows, and unspeakable truths had begun. As dawn broke over the bayou, a grey light filtered through the thick canopy of moss-laden trees, casting an eerie pallor over the mansion's exterior. Isabella Duval stirred in her guest chamber, the shadows of the night still clinging to the corners of the room. Sleep had been a restless companion. Her dreams were filled with fragmented images of pale faces, silent screams, and hands reaching from the murky waters of the swamp. The chill of the morning air bit at her skin, but it was not coldness alone that made her shiver. Something in the house, a presence almost tangible, had begun to whisper to her in the quiet hours, urging her to uncover the truths that had been buried beneath decades of secrecy. She dressed quickly, her fingers trembling slightly as she fastened the delicate buttons on her gown. Isabella's mind wandered back to the journals she had glimpsed the previous evening in the library, a collection of old leather-bound books, some company, veiled in dust so thick that it seemed almost impossible they had been touched in years. She remembered the faded ink of one particular diary, the spidery handwriting that seemed to writhe on the page as though alive, and the disturbing entries that spoke of sudden disappearances and the hushed terror that had gripped the plantation's staff and slaves alike. Her heart pounded as she resolved to search more thoroughly, to understand the darkness that had taken root within these walls. Stepping into the hallway, Isabella noticed the faint outlines of past tragedies in the architecture itself. The floorboards creaked beneath her weight, groaning under the memory of countless footsteps that had crossed them, each step a silent witness to a story of fear and sorrow. The air carried the faint scent of decay mingled with something richer, perhaps the lingering aroma of candle wax and perfumed oils once meant to mask the stench of suffering. She shivered again but pushed forward, driven by a curiosity that had grown into an almost urgent need to confront whatever lay hidden. Her first stop was the library, a room that now seemed even more ominous in the early light. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that managed to pierce the grimy windows, and the towering shelves seemed to lean toward her, as if eager to reveal the secrets they had held for so long. Isabella ran her fingers along the spines of books, some cracked and fragile, others surprisingly intact. She pulled out one tome at random and opened it, the brittle pages rustling like dry leaves in the stillness. What she found made her blood run cold, a detailed record of the plantation's operations, but interspersed with cryptic notations about unclaimed bodies and the swamp's favor, phrases that hinted at horrors she could scarcely comprehend. She turned page after page, her eyes scanning the meticulous hand, writing of someone who had documented the suffering of the enslaved with a clinical precision that was chilling. The entries spoke of punishments carried out in the dead of night, of individuals taken without explanation, and of an unspoken agreement among the plantation's leaders to conceal the disappearances. Each paragraph seemed to thrum with a quiet menace, as though the very ink had absorbed the anguish of those it described. Isabella's heart raced as she realized that these were not mere stories or exaggerations. They were records of reality, meticulously hidden from outsiders, preserved as both warning and testament. A sudden noise from upstairs made her start. The soft creak of a door, the whisper of a footstep against the old wooden floors. Isabella froze, straining to hear, but the mansion remained otherwise silent, as if holding its breath. Her instinct was to retreat, to close the diary and leave the mansion's secrets buried. But something inside her compelled her to continue. She was not merely a visitor here, she had become an intruder into a living history of terror, and turning back now would mean leaving the truth undiscovered. She moved cautiously up the staircase, her hand trailing along the smooth but cold banister. Shadows clung to the walls like living things, stretching and shifting with the angle of the morning light. At the top, a narrow hallway stretched before her, lined with doors that seemed almost identical, each hiding some piece of the mansion's grim story. She chose one at random and pushed it open, revealing a room that had once been a servant's quarters. The air was heavy with dust, and the faint outline of a bed frame and wooden chest could barely be made out through the haze. Isabella knelt to inspect the chest and discovered letters, some yellowed with age, others more recent, each describing the daily lives of the enslaved, their fears, their moments of fleeting hope, and, most chillingly, their sudden disappearances. One letter, written in a shaky hand, described the night when several slaves vanished into the swamp, never to be seen again. The writer spoke of hearing the cries of the victims echo across the water, muffled by the thick mist and darkness, a sound that would haunt the survivors forever. Isabella could almost hear it herself, a faint, ghostly chorus carried on the wind, and she shivered violently. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow, but she forced herself to keep reading. Every detail, every name, every timestamp was a thread leading her deeper into the macabre tapestry of the plantation's history. Suddenly, a gust of wind slammed the door shut behind her, sending a cascade of dust into the room. Isabella stumbled back, heart hammering, and for a moment panic threatened to overtake her curiosity. Yet, as she steadied herself, she realized that this house, with all its secrets and darkness, was testing her resolve. It demanded that she confront its truths, that she bear witness to the atrocities that had been committed within its walls. And so, trembling but determined, she continued to sift through the letters, uncovering stories of cruelty that were both systematic and deeply personal. Slaves punished for minor infractions, hidden rituals conducted in secrecy, and a pervasive sense of fear that had been instilled from the moment one set foot on the plantation grounds. Hours seemed to pass as she pored over the documents, the morning fading into an overcast afternoon. Isabella's mind began to piece together the grim puzzle. The plantation's wealth had been built not merely on labor, but on a system of terror and suppression, on the deliberate concealment of suffering, and on the exploitation of the swamp itself. The writings hinted at a ritualistic aspect, a belief that the swamp could consume those deemed expendable, that it had a will of its own, and that obedience to the plantation's cruel hierarchy was enforced not just by fear, but by the very land itself. Her attention was drawn to a final set of documents hidden at the very back of the chest. These were not mere accounts or letters, they were diaries, detailed accounts of events that had taken place over several years. The handwriting was more deliberate here, almost reverent, as though the writer considered their records sacred. The entries chronicled the precise methods by which individuals were led to the swamp, how others were coerced into silence, and the strange, almost supernatural aura that seemed to protect the plantation from prying eyes. Isabella's stomach churned as she read, the weight of history pressing down upon her. She realized that this was not just a story of cruelty, but of a darkness that had permeated the land itself, shaping every life within its reach. The mansion seemed to respond to her realization. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and the faint whisper of movement drifted through the hallways, as if the house itself was acknowledging her presence and her intrusion into its secrets. Isabella felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration, a recognition that she was no longer merely a passive observer. She was part of the story now, entwined with the fates of those who had suffered and those who had perpetrated unspeakable acts. Every creak, every draft, every flicker of light became a signal, a reminder that the past was alive here, watching, waiting for her to decide how she would respond. By the time she finally left the room, clutching the diaries and letters, Isabella's mind was a whirlwind of emotion, horror, sorrow, curiosity, and a growing determination. She moved to the window, looking out over the swamp, and imagined the countless lives that had been swallowed by the mist and murky waters. The bayou stretched endlessly, beautiful and deadly, its surface shimmering with reflections of the dark cypress trees. Somewhere in that water lay the truth, and Isabella knew she would have to confront it directly if she wished to fully understand the legacy of the mansion and the bride who had come before her. The realization settled in her chest like a stone. The history of the plantation, its wealth and its tragedies were inseparable from the swamp. The water, the trees, the very air of the bayou had absorbed centuries of suffering and secrecy. And now Isabella stood at the threshold of a revelation that would change everything, not just for her, but for anyone who had come to know the mansion and its macabre past. She could feel the story calling to her, pulling her forward into darkness, but also promising understanding, exposure, and perhaps justice. As evening approached, Isabella retreated to the sitting room she had explored the previous day. She lit a single candle, its flickering flame casting long shadows across the walls lined with portraits of grim-faced ancestors. The mansion's secrets were no longer hidden. They had been unveiled, at least partially, and she understood that the coming days would demand courage, wit, and a willingness to face horrors that most could not imagine. But as she gazed into the swamp through the tall window, she felt a strange sense of connection, as though she had been chosen to witness the truth, to carry the stories of the lost and the forgotten into the light of the present. In the quiet of the bayou night, with the wind whispering through the trees and the water lapping softly against the banks, Isabella felt both the weight and the power of knowledge. She knew that uncovering the dark secrets of the plantation was only the beginning. The house, the swamp, the shadows of the past would not yield their stories easily, and yet she also knew that she could not turn away. Not now, not when the truth waited just beyond the veil of mist and darkness, ready to be revealed. Night had fallen over the Louisiana Bayou, and the mansion loomed like a silent sentinel against the darkened sky. The mist had thickened, curling through the cypress trees and settling over the water in ghostly tendrils, hiding the swamp's secrets beneath its opaque surface. Isabella Duval moved cautiously through the dimly lit hallways, clutching the diaries and letters she had uncovered earlier. Each step she took seemed louder than the last, echoing off the high ceilings, bouncing between the walls, as if the house itself were aware of her intrusion and mocking her bravery. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, but she could not stop. Something deeper, an instinct she could not name, pushed her forward. It was in the shadowed corner of a long corridor that she first heard it, a faint shuffle, soft but deliberate, followed by the rustle of fabric. Isabella froze, every muscle taut, straining to identify the source. Her mind raced, conjuring up the worst possibilities, an intruder, a member of the household come to scold her, or worse, the spectres she feared might inhabit this cursed place. Then a voice, barely a whisper, reached her ears. "Who's there?" It was soft, tremulous, and filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Isabella's pulse quickened. She called out gently, "It's me, Isabella. I mean no harm." From the shadows emerged a figure, hunched slightly, cloaked in ragged clothing that had seen years of wear. The woman's skin was dark, her eyes wide and wary, scanning Isabella for threats. There was something unearthly in her presence, as though she belonged more to the swamp than to the mansion. "You shouldn't be here," she said again, her voice firmer this time, but still edged with fear. Isabella stepped closer, holding out a hand in peace, her own voice trembling slightly. "I have to know the truth about this place, about what's happened here." The woman studied her for a long moment before sighing, as if surrendering to inevitability. "I suppose you already know some of it," she said. "The others, they never wanted anyone to know." Her name, Isabella learned, was Marie. She was a survivor, one of the few enslaved people who had escaped the horrors of the swamp and the cruel machinations of the plantation owners. Her story was fragmented at first, broken by pauses and glances over her shoulder, but it was clear that she carried the weight of years in hiding, of watching, waiting, and surviving in silence. Marie led Isabella to a small hidden room behind the pantry, a place that had been used for storage but now served as a refuge. The walls were lined with old crates, dust thick upon every surface, and the single candle flickering in the corner cast elongated, dancing shadows that made the room seem both smaller and infinitely larger at the same time. Isabella noticed the faint smell of damp earth and the faint tang of smoke, remnants of fires long past but carefully maintained to preserve life within this hidden sanctuary. It was a place that had never been meant for visitors, and yet here she was, drawn into a story that had been kept secret for decades. Marie spoke carefully, her voice low but steady. She told Isabella about the disappearances she had witnessed, about the terror instilled in the plantation's slaves, and about the rituals that had been performed under the cover of night. Each account was more chilling than the last. Nights when individuals were led into the swamp under false pretenses, never to return, overseers who enforced obedience with merciless cruelty, and a hierarchy amo. The household that punished curiosity and punished mercy with equal severity. Isabella listened, heart racing, every revelation layering fear with determination. "I've survived because I know the swamp," Marie said, her eyes dark pools reflecting years of hardship. "It hides me, it shields me, and I know its ways. But I can't stay hidden forever. They watch for every mistake, every whisper, every step that strays from the expected." Isabella's mind raced with questions. The others, the ones who disappeared, what happened to them? Marie's eyes darkened. The swamp took them. That's what they say, but the truth is darker than any story. They were not meant to survive. They were offered to it, fed to it, to keep the plantation prosperous, to keep the master's power unchallenged. And the bride before you, she was complicit, though she didn't know everything at first. Isabella felt a shiver trace her spine. The stories she had read in the diaries were not exaggerations. They were fragments of a reality far more horrific than she had imagined. The mansion, the swamp, the very land around her, everything was alive with the weight of cruelty and secrecy. And yet, as she listened to Marie's story, she also felt a strange surge of connection, a recognition that they shared a common purpose now. The truth had to be exposed. Over the next few hours, Marie guided Isabella through a detailed understanding of the plantation's layout, including secret passages, hidden rooms, and areas of the swamp that could be traversed safely only by someone with intimate knowledge of the terrain. Isabella absorbed every detail, her mind racing as she imagined confronting the horrors she had read about and now seen through Marie's eyes. The mansion's corridors, once threatening in their silence, now appeared as pathways to discovery, each door a potential revelation, each shadow a clue to mysteries the estate held. As they moved through the hidden passages, Isabella's fear was tempered by a growing resolve. She realized that knowledge alone would not be enough. Action was required. She needed to understand the full extent of the darkness, to witness it, and to find a way to challenge it. The alliance she formed with Marie was not just practical, it was moral, a shared commitment to justice and survival. Marie, hardened by years of oppression, was cautious but willing to trust Isabella, sensing in her a determination that matched her own. Together, they became a force capable of confronting the cruelty that had long gone unchecked. In one of the secret rooms, Isabella discovered remnants of past rituals, symbols carved into wooden beams, fragments of fabric stained with unknown substances, and bones, small and fragile, hidden beneath floorboards. The sight made her stomach twist, a visceral reaction to the tangible presence of past horrors. Marie explained each artifact with solemn precision, detailing the events they represented without embellishment, her voice steady even as her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Isabella's heart ached for the victims, but her determination only grew. She could not allow the horrors to remain hidden, not when she now had the means to document and confront them. Night deepened over the bayou, and the shadows grew longer, stretching through the hidden passages like living entities. Isabella and Marie paused by a small window overlooking the swamp, the mist curling around the water's edge like ghostly fingers. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Marie said quietly, almost to herself. Isabella nodded, though the beauty was tempered by knowledge of the swamp's dark history. "It hides everything," Marie continued, "and sometimes it protects those who are clever enough to survive. I've lived here, in its shadows, because I learn. had to respect it, to understand it. The others never did, and they paid the price. The alliance between Isabella and Marie solidified as they discussed plans for uncovering the truth and surviving the dangers that lurked both within the mansion and in the surrounding swamp. Every corner of the plantation became a potential threat, every creaking board a warning, yet also an opportunity. They shared stories of the past and strategies for the future, blending fear with cunning and learning to trust one another in a world where trust had long been a scarce commodity. By the early hours of the morning, Isabella had begun to feel a shift within herself. The fear that had dominated her initial days on the plantation was now tempered by purpose. She understood that the mansion's history, as horrifying as it was, could not define her entirely. She had a role to play, not just as an observer, but as a participant in uncovering the truths long buried beneath the Bayou's mist. Marie's presence provided both guidance and a mirror, reflecting the bravery Isabella would need to summon in order to face the darkness head-on. As the first light of dawn pierced through the heavy fog, Isabella and Marie retreated to the hidden room to rest, the candle flickering softly between them. The mansion outside remained silent, as though waiting to see what choices they would make. Isabella knew that the alliance they had formed was fragile but necessary. Together they could confront the horrors, navigate the swamp, and perhaps even begin to unravel the web of cruelty that had ensnared the plantation for generations. It was a tentative, uneasy partnership, born of necessity and courage, yet it carried with it the weight of hope, the faint possibility that light could exist even in the darkest of places. Night had fallen again over the Louisiana Bayou, though this time it was darker, heavier, as if the swamp itself had gathered its shadows in anticipation of the events to come. Mist rolled over the water like a living entity, curling and twisting around the gnarled cypress roots, hiding the unseen dangers lurking beneath the surface. The air was thick with humidity and the faint stench of decay, carrying the sounds of frogs, insects, and distant animal cries that echoed through the labyrinth of water and trees. Isabella Duval moved cautiously beside Marie, her breath shallow, her every sense heightened. Each step on the damp, uneven ground threatened to sink them into the mud, and the swamp seemed to protest their intrusion, groaning and whispering in ways only the night could understand. Marie led the way with confidence, her bare feet barely making a sound as they navigated the maze of roots and shallow channels. Isabella followed, clutching a small lantern that cast flickering light onto the dark water, revealing twisted branches and patches of thick fog. She had never known fear like this, a cold, pressing dread that seeped into her bones and whispered warnings of danger around every bend. Yet intertwined with that fear was determination, a fierce need to confront the horrors she had uncovered in the mansion and now knew were physically manifested in the swamp itself. She understood that the fate of those who had disappeared, and perhaps the fate of her own soul, depended on the choices she made in these shadowed waters. As they moved deeper into the swamp, Isabella could see faint traces of past lives, broken branches, trampled reeds, and the remnants of small fires long extinguished. It was as though the land itself had absorbed the memories of every atrocity that had occurred here, leaving physical marks for those sensitive enough to notice. Marie paused at a particularly dense patch of mist, crouching low to whisper. "This is where it happened, L.A. "It's time," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a weight to it that made Isabella's stomach twist. She followed Marie's gaze to a shallow depression in the ground, half filled with water, where the fog was thickest. It was easy to imagine the screams that might have carried across the swamp, muffled by the distance and the oppressive canopy of trees. Every sound in the swamp seemed amplified, every rustle of leaves or splash of water causing Isabella's heart to leap. Her imagination raced with the terrifying scenarios Marie's stories had hinted at: overseers dragging unwilling victims through the marsh, rituals conducted in secrecy, and the eerie, inexplicable way the swamp seemed to swallow those who resisted. And yet, there was a strange beauty to the landscape, an almost hypnotic quality to the mist and moonlight, which made it impossible for her to turn away. She felt as though she was being drawn into the swamp's embrace, both as a witness and as a participant in its dark story. They reached a small clearing where the water was deeper, its surface eerily still and reflective, capturing the twisted silhouettes of the trees above. Marie stopped and crouched low, motioning for Isabella to do the same. "They'll be here soon," she whispered. Isabella's pulse quickened. She understood immediately that this was not only a confrontation with the swamp itself, but with the people who had perpetrated the plantation's cruelest acts. The overseers and her husband's distant relatives, the ones who had maintained the terror, would not tolerate intrusion lightly. Isabella's fear mingled with adrenaline. She felt every muscle tense, ready to react to whatever came next. Suddenly the silence was shattered by the faint snap of a branch, a sound that seemed disproportionately loud in the still night. Isabella's heart lurched as she realized that someone or something was moving toward them, hidden in the shadows, but close enough to strike. She gripped the lantern tightly, the flickering flame revealing figures emerging from the fog, men with faces grim, weapons in hand, moving with the arrogance of those who had been protected by the swamp's darkness for too long. They paused, sensing something amiss, their eyes scanning the shadows, and Isabella felt the weight of their scrutiny like a physical force pressing against her chest. Marie raised a hand, signaling Isabella to stay low, and whispered instructions on how to move without attracting attention. Isabella followed, her body pressed against the roots of a cypress tree, trying to control the tremor in her hands. She could feel the presence of danger with every fiber of her being, the tension in the air, the rustle of leaves, the faint, almost imperceptible hiss of water brushing against the roots. The swamp was alive, but it was now an ally in subtle ways, hiding them momentarily, offering cover in its labyrinth of mud and mist. Isabella realized that she had to rely on more than courage. She had to learn to trust the swamp itself, to move as Marie did, with instinct and awareness honed by experience. Through whispered guidance, Marie led Isabella to the edge of the clearing, where a narrow channel of water twisted through the roots like a hidden passage. They moved cautiously, feeling their way over slippery mud and submerged branches, the lantern casting fleeting light onto the water's surface. Shadows danced like specters, and Isabella's mind played tricks on her, seeing shapes in the fog that might have been memories of past victims or merely illusions conjured by fear. Each step was a battle between instinct to flee and the need to see the truth, to confront the horrors that had haunted the plantation for decades. As they advanced, Isabella glimpsed figures in the distance, overseers standing near the swamp's edge, their faces masked by the darkness, their postures rigid and threatening. Her stomach knotted, and for a fleeting moment, panic surged. But Marie's calm presence anchored her. "Focus," Marie whispered. "We know the swamp. They do not." Isabella nodded, letting her fear become a tool rather than a barrier, heightening her awareness of every detail, the way the reeds bent in the wind, the faint ripple of water signaling movement beneath the surface, the distant call of an owl marking time. The confrontation escalated quickly. The overseers moved closer, unaware of the hidden figures navigating the swamp's secret passages. Isabella and Marie crept silently, using the thick mist as cover, until they were close enough to witness the full extent of the horrors committed in the night. Bodies, partially concealed by the water and muck, told the story more vividly than words ever could. It was a grisly tableau of the plantation's cruelty, a visual testament to the suffering that had been hidden from the outside world. Isabella felt bile rise in her throat, but she forced herself to remain focused, documenting the scene mentally, understanding that knowledge and observation were her weapons as much as Cora. Suddenly, one of the overseers noticed movement, a flicker of shadow against the dense fog. He raised a lantern, its light slicing through the mist, and shouted orders that echoed across the swamp. Isabella's heart pounded as she realized they had been discovered. Marie's eyes met hers, a silent communication passing between them. They could not turn back, and retreat would mean exposure and potential death. Isabella tightened her grip on the lantern, the flame trembling in her hand, and followed Marie's lead as they moved swiftly through the channel, ducking under branches and avoiding patches of open water. The swamp became both obstacle and ally, forcing them into the darkness while concealing their presence. The confrontation reached its climax when Isabella and Marie emerged onto a small island of solid ground at the center of the swamp. The overseers had spread out, their shouts growing more frustrated, their confusion evident as they struggled to follow the movements of two figures invisible in the mist. Isabella took a deep breath, the adrenaline coursing through her veins, and prepared to face the human embodiment of the plantation's cruelty directly. She understood now that the swamp had tested them, filtered out the weak, and brought them to this point not by chance but by design. Every nerve in her body screamed with the need to survive, but also with the determination to confront the truth. Marie, standing beside her, whispered a final set of instructions, pointing out the weaknesses in the overseers' positions, the paths that offered both cover and advantage. Isabella listened intently, every word sharpening her focus, every shadow teaching her the rhythm of the swamp at night. And then, with courage born of desperation and necessity, they moved forward, confronting the overseers with a combination of calculated stealth and the moral weight of Thai. Mission. The swamp itself seemed to rise in support, the mist thickening to obscure their movements, the water rippling subtly as if guiding them toward justice. The confrontation was chaotic and tense. Yells and splashes echoed across the swamp, the overseers scrambling to maintain control as Isabella and Marie maneuvered with skill and determination. Fear surged through Isabella, but it was tempered by clarity. She was no longer a passive observer. She had become a force of reckoning, guided by knowledge, instinct, and the unwavering support of Marie. Every movement, every breath, every glance was calculated, and slowly the balance shifted. The overseer's confidence faltered under the combination of human cunning and the swamp's obscure protection. By the time the confrontation ended, with the overseers retreating into the shadows or trapped in the swamp's deeper channels, Isabella stood on the small island, her chest heaving, her body trembling from exertion and fear. Marie stood beside her, equally exhausted but resolute, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared triumph. The swamp was silent once more, the mist curling around them like a cloak of protection, the echoes of the past seeming to settle in acknowledgement. Isabella realized that the horrors she had uncovered were not merely stories of cruelty, but challenges she had survived, confrontations that demanded courage, intellect, and unwavering resolve. As dawn's first light began to pierce the mist once again, illuminating the twisted cypress roots and still waters of the swamp, Isabella understood the full gravity of what they had accomplished. They had faced the plantation's terror, witnessed the true extent of its atrocities, and emerged not broken but empowered. The swamp, once a place of fear and mystery, had become an ally, a guardian of truth, and a witness to the courage of two women determined to confront darkness with both strategy and heart. The first light of dawn crept slowly across the Louisiana Bayou, casting long, ghostly shadows over the water. Mist clung to the cypress roots like silk, curling and shifting with the soft morning breeze, and the swamp seemed almost alive, as if it had witnessed the previous night's events and was now exhaling a deep, long-held breath. Isabella Duval stood on the edge of the small clearing where the confrontation had taken place, her clothes damp with mud and sweat, her face streaked with the grime and tears of a night spent navigating the swamp's treacherous depths. Beside her, Marie stood silently, her dark eyes scanning the misty horizon, alert yet composed, the hard years of survival etched into every line of her face. Together, they were a striking contrast of elegance and resilience against the wild, untamed backdrop of the bayou. The swamp, which had once seemed a place of terror, now held a different resonance for Isabella. Every ripple in the water, every rustle of leaves, every whisper of wind through the moss-laden branches seemed imbued with memory. The horrors she had witnessed, the bodies, the rituals, the overseer's cruelty, were now balanced by an understanding of courage, survival, and the possibility of justice. She realized that the swamp itself had not only concealed the plantation's darkest secrets, but had also protected the few who had the will and knowledge to survive. It had been both a prison and a refuge, a mirror reflecting the human capacity for both evil and resilience. Isabella thought of the enslaved souls whose lives had been consumed by the swamp, their fates entwined with the plantation's prosperity. The weight of history pressed upon her as she recalled the diaries, letters, and first-hand accounts she had uncovered. Fragments of stories pieced together like shards of glass, each narrate. Ive was a testament to suffering endured, courage shown in silence, and the resilience required to endure the unthinkable. She felt the enormity of the responsibility now resting on her shoulders to honor their memory, to ensure that the horrors were not forgotten, and to expose the truths that had been buried for decades. The mansion behind them stood silent, its windows dark, its walls heavy with secrets. Isabella could almost hear the echoes of the past, the whispered commands of the overseers, the muffled cries of the enslaved, and the faint laughter of those who believed themselves untouchable. Yet in the midst of this darkness, there was a sense of change, a subtle shift in the balance of power. The secrets had been revealed, at least in part, and the power of knowledge had become a weapon in the hands of those brave enough to wield it. Marie had guided Isabella to this understanding, teaching her to navigate the swamp, interpret the signs of danger, and confront the cruelty embedded in both the land and the hearts of men. As they made their way back toward the mansion, the swamp seemed to acknowledge their passage. The mist swirled differently, parting at times to reveal the twisted roots and dark waters as though granting them permission to move forward. Isabella's mind raced with the implications of what had been uncovered. The overseers had retreated, but the story of their deeds could not remain hidden any longer. The diaries and letters she carried were more than documentation, they were evidence, a bridge between the past and the present, and a tool to ensure that justice, however delayed, could be sought. Entering the mansion once more, Isabella was struck by the oppressive weight of its history. The walls seemed to close in, the portraits of grim-faced ancestors observing her with unyielding scrutiny. Every room held a memory, a fragment of cruelty, or survival frozen in time. She wandered through the halls, letting her fingers trace the carvings in the wood, the faded upholstery, the dust-laden furniture, absorbing the physical echoes of a life she had only just begun to comprehend. It was as if the house itself was challenging her, to confront, to remember, and to carry forward the truth of what had occurred within its walls. Isabella and Marie spent the following days moving through the mansion with cautious purpose, documenting every detail they could find. Hidden rooms, secret compartments, and forgotten archives revealed further insights into the plantation's operations and the lives of those enslaved. Isabella's shock and grief were tempered by a growing clarity. She was piecing together a narrative that demanded to be told, a story that required courage and careful handling. Every note, every diary entry, every artifact was a thread in a tapestry of suffering and resilience, and she understood that the full picture was both horrifying and necessary to confront. Their work brought them to the bayou itself once more. Isabella stood at the water's edge, the morning light glinting off the rippling surface, and reflected on the countless lives that had been claimed by the swamp. The realization was almost unbearable. The beauty of the landscape had masked centuries of pain and injustice, and yet that same beauty had also concealed the means for survival and revelation. She felt an intimate connection to the land now, a sense that to understand the swamp was to understand both the cruelty and the courage that had shaped it. Marie spoke softly, breaking Isabella's reverie. "We cannot undo what has been done," she said, her voice carrying a weight of experience and sorrow. "But we can ensure it is remembered, and we can make sure the world knows the truth." Isabella nodded, absorbing the gravity of her words. They had survived the night, exposed some of the horrors, and uncovered the truth, but their mission was far from complete. Knowledge alone was not enough. It had to be shared, it had to be preserved, and it had to carry the weight of the lives lost and the suffering endured. In the weeks that followed, Isabella and Marie worked together tirelessly. The diaries, letters, and first-hand accounts were meticulously organized, cross-referenced, and preserved. The mansion, once a symbol of hidden cruelty, became a repository of truth and testimony. Isabella's understanding of the plantation, its history and its people, deepened with each discovery, revealing layers of complexity and horror intertwined with resilience and survival. She realized that the legacy of the swamp was not merely one of darkness but also of empowerment, born from the courage of those who had lived through its trials. Word of the horrors began to spread, cautiously at first, through trusted intermediaries and careful communication. Local authorities were alerted, and some of the plantation's crimes were brought into the light, though not without resistance. Isabella faced skepticism, threats, and disbelief, but the evidence she carried, combined with the first-hand testimony of Marie, made it impossible to ignore. The swamp, which had once protected secrecy, now bore witness to justice. The land that had swallowed so many became a catalyst for truth, ensuring that the macabre legacy of the plantation could no longer be concealed. Isabella's own transformation was profound. The frightened bride who had arrived at the Bayou mansion weeks before had become a woman of strength, determination, and insight. She had confronted unimaginable horrors, navigated a treacherous landscape, both literal and metaphorical, and formed an alliance that defied society, boundaries, and fear. Her courage was now intertwined with Marie's survival, their partnership a testament to the power of trust, knowledge, and shared purpose. Together, they had turned a site of terror into a source of revelation and empowerment. As months passed, the mansion itself seemed to respond to the shift. The oppressive atmosphere that had haunted its halls lifted slightly, replaced by a sense of acknowledgement, as if the building recognized the uncovering of its long-hidden truths. Shadows remained, of course, and the mist still clung to the bayou, but they were no longer simply instruments of fear. They were reminders of the past, teachers of history, and symbols of resilience. Isabella often stood at the water's edge, gazing across the swamp, reflecting on the lives that had been lost, and finding a strange solace in the knowledge that their stories would endure. The legacy of the plantation and the swamp was macabre, undeniably so, but it was also a legacy of revelation. The truth, once hidden, now had the power to educate, warn, and honor the memories of those who had suffered. Isabella understood that this was her role, her responsibility, to carry the story forward, to illuminate the darkness, and to ensure that the lessons of the past would not be forgotten. The Bayou, in all its beauty and terror, had shaped her, tested her, and ultimately entrusted her with the mantle of remembrance. In the quiet moments, when the sun dipped behind the trees and the mist settled once again over the water, Isabella would think of the enslaved souls, of Marie, and of the previous bride whose choices had shaped the history she now understood. There was sorrow, but also triumph. The swamp had been both a grave and a sanctuary, a place of horror and of survival, and Isabella had learned to navigate its complexities. The legacy of the plantation would always carry the weight of its past, but it was no longer invisible. The story had been uncovered, and in its revelation lay a form of justice and acknowledgement that could endure across generations. As Isabella walked through the mansion one last time, she paused in the main hall, feeling the weight of the portraits and the silent testimonies they bore. She understood, with a clarity born of experience and courage, that the macabre legacy of the Louisiana plantation was not just a story of darkness, it was a story of resilience, survival, and the enduring power of truth. The swamp, the mansion, and the lives it had claimed would continue to haunt, but now they would do so with the light of understanding and remembrance shining upon them.